the story. Afterwards, I will explain what made it possible for Korea to grow so fast. And then I will finish by drawing conclusive messages for Cameroon from lessons Korea has learned. Korea underwent a series of unfortunate events in the first half of the 20th century. In 1910, Korea was colonized by Japan, which marked the beginning of one of the darkest periods Korea had ever experienced. Korea fiercely resisted and fought Japan's colonial rule and regained her independence in 1945 at the end of the World War II. Nonetheless, the Cold War immediately set in, and Korea was divided into North and South Koreas. In the southern half of the peninsula, the Republic of Korea was founded in 1948 under the auspices of the United Nations. The joy of a new beginning for the Republic of Korea didn't last long. Only 2 years later, in 1950, the Korean War broke out. During 3 years of devastating warfare, over 4 million people were killed or wounded. The infrastructure of the economy was severely destroyed. Seoul was almost completely burnt to ashes, and orphans and refugees roamed the cities and the countryside searching for their lost loved ones. Malnutrition and disease were everywhere. I still have memories of the difficult times both during and after the war. Towards the end of the 1950s, Korea's per capita GDP ranked 101st out of 125 nations. In 1962, Korea's per capita GDP was less than 100 US dollars. Over 40% of the nation's population suffered from absolute poverty, and it seemed as if there was no way out. But in 2015, Korea recorded approximately 28,000 US dollars in per capita GDP. This value, when converted into purchasing power, is higher than that of Italy and approaches the average per capita GDP of EU nations. Korea's GDP recorded 11th in 2015 with 1.4 trillion US dollars. Korea is the first and the only nation to transition from a foreign aid recipient nation to a donor nation in the world history. Some people refer this achievement as the Korean miracle. Natural question to ask would be, how did Korea do it? Numerous scholars have asked the same question and analyzed Korea's economic development in search of an answer. There cannot be one right answer to this question, but I will share a few points that stand out for me personally. First point I would like to mention is Korea's export-led growth strategy. Most economists agree that Korea's success lies in the adoption of such strategy as well. But focus is on the word strategy, not on export-led growth. If export-led growth policy is the universal key to rapid growth for all developing nations, why have some countries that have adopted this policy not been as successful as Korea? Korea is not endowed with rich natural resources. She has limited supplies of coal, iron, tungsten, limestone, and kaolin, while other resources are scarce or non-existent. Arable land accounts for just 20% of total land. Climate, soil, rainfall, and temperature are all unfavorable to agricultural production. On the other hand, Korea has advantage in human capital. Even right after the end of the Korean War, population of Korea was increasing at about 3% per year. In addition, Korea is among the most densely populated countries in the world, with 517 people per square kilometer, which is one of the highest in the world. This meant that Korea had widespread surplus labor at its initial phase of development with low wage rate. This accounts for one of the key differences between Korea and other nations. In addition, it takes more than labor surplus to develop manufacturing industries effectively. The labor force has to be equipped with those attributes required for modern industrial activities. For example, a minimum standard of literacy, discipline, and a desire to get ahead. Furthermore, there has to be vigorous entrepreneurship, administrative skill, and efficiency in government. In this regard, Korea was well equipped for manufacturing. Years of subsisting on scarce land have nurtured strong survival traits such as tenacity and pragmatism. The potential labor force was largely literate and ready to work long hours for low wages. Many entrepreneurs with a can-do spirit emerged. They took advantage of the government policy encouraging investment with favorable bank loans and allocation of foreign exchange. In short, we cannot say that export-led growth strategy is the key to fast economic growth in all developing nations. Rather, it takes a careful analysis of the nation and deliberate economic planning in accordance with the analysis. Cameroon is located in a geographically strategic area, has rich agricultural resources, and English and French-speaking people. How do these advantages translate into a strategy is the job for this conference. But it is imperative to devise a plan that accounts for Cameroon's advantages and disadvantages. In that sense, Cameroon's Vision 2035 and three-year emergency plan for 2015 to 2017 appears to be a good starting point, and I hope that lessons from Korea will help Cameroon execute its plan as intended. Second, a focus on education and investment in human capital was critical. With no significant natural resources or accumulated capital, South Korea had to rely on highly educated workforce to drive economic growth. Passion for education has a long heritage in Korea. Perhaps a famous anecdote will help you to understand the Korean people's attitude toward education. It involves a 16th century scholar, Seokbong Han, who is recognized as one of the foremost calligraphers in Korean history. I'll refer to him as Han. Han's mother, despite her desire to keep her son by her side, sent him to a Buddhist temple in the mountain so that he could focus on studies away from distractions. Some years later, still immature and unmotivated, Han returned home one day and told his mother that he no longer wished to pursue calligraphy. Although she was delighted to see her son again, she was determined to see him finish his education. His mother, who was supporting Han by selling rice cake in the marketplace, proposed a contest. They would turn the candlelight off, and if Han could write calligraphy better, then she could slice the rice cake in complete darkness then he could do whatever he wanted. When they turned the candlelight back on, Hans' calligraphy was humiliating at best, while each piece of the rice cake sliced by his mother boasted perfect form and size. Realizing that his studies and practice didn't come close to completion, Han was humbled and returned to the temple, determined never to return home until he could be the best calligrapher in Joseon dynasty. Can you imagine yourself in place of Han? First, your mom sends you off to a remote temple in the mountains. When you return, she scolds you for being immature and sends you back until you make enough progress in your studies. This is how much the Koreans value education. The tradition still pushes Korean people to study more and to work harder. I myself had numerous helpers and mentors who allowed me to fulfill my academic pursuits. I was born in a countryside, and during my elementary school years, my family couldn't afford even my lunches. My mother worked at a hospital washing clothes to support my siblings and me during the tough post-war years. She kept reminding me of a confidence that a bright future awaited me so that poverty wouldn't discourage me. I worked as a tutor since the high school years all the way through college to earn tuitions, but I never neglected my own academics. Besides my mother, I had others who imbued me with confidence throughout my youth. They all had a passion for education. Without the conviction of my supporters and professors, my academic path from the countryside to Seoul to the United States and myself today would not have been possible. Thank you. The third factor for South Korea's rise is the can-do or fighting spirit of the Korean people that I had briefly mentioned earlier. This type of spirit is crucial to every successful entrepreneur. During the rapid industrialization process, many South Koreans worked tremendously hard to help themselves, their families, and their communities to climb out of poverty and build a foundation for a market-driven society. Wherever there were jobs, our young men and women went to faraway countries to grab the opportunities. In the 1960s, South Koreans went to then West Germany to work as coal miners and nurses. Impressed with the Korean work ethic, the West German government was one of the first friends to extend to South Korea industrial development loans. In the 1970s, with the construction boom in the Middle East, so many South Korean construction workers helped to build key infrastructures and development projects in the region. The wages these workers earned and sent back home allowed their families to send their children to college. At the end of the 1990s, South Korea overcame the Asian financial crisis in only a couple of years. The crisis of 1997 to 1998 was South Korea's own Great Depression. Almost a third of the nation's banks and lending institutions went under, and in a span of months, only 7% of workers were out of jobs. South Korea came out of the crisis thanks to collective willpower of its citizens who spent less, saved more, worked harder, increased exports, and strove to be more competitive. So far, I have discussed the factors accounting for Korea's rapid economic growth. Careful economic planning and deliberate execution, value of education, and can-do spirit of the Korean people account for some of the reasons behind Korea's economic development. But that is not the end of the story. Korea may have achieved an economic miracle, but whether that miracle is a sustainable one remains questionable due to polarization of wealth and sluggish economic growth in recent years. Korea's economic development in the formative years adopted theory of unbalanced growth. That is, Korean government allocated resources to industries that exhibited highest potentials instead of distributing resources throughout all industries. The strategy was successful in growing the economy, but at the cost of economic equality. In other words, corporations that benefited from the government's policies became global conglomerates today, but their economic influences are overshadowing small and medium enterprises, also known as SMEs. Gini coefficient in Korea is rising fast, and wealth is being polarized, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And the economic growth rate is not as high as it once used to be. A list of solutions would include well-educated population, many engineers, designers, and other professionals, enormous deposits of knowledge, educated capital, strong public education, efficient economic institutions, and legal system congenial to the promotion of entrepreneurship, etc., etc. But I'd like to emphasize that the solution can be summed up as two words: shared growth. It may be unconventional to discuss topics like shared growth in developing nations, but I propose Cameroon to keep shared growth in mind, because first, the vicious cycle of rich gets richer and poor gets poorer is extremely difficult to break after the country's economy grows. And second, shared growth will help Cameroon find a more sustainable model for economic growth. To briefly explain, shared growth is a philosophy that promotes economically growing together. Various scholars in different fields may refer to it with a slightly different name. For example, Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders uses the term inclusive economy, which shares similar ideas with shared growth. What is more important than what we quoted is what growing together truly means. By growing together, shared growth aims to promote fairer distribution without curbing vigorous economic growth. People sometimes misconstrue shared growth as another distribution mechanism that takes away from the rich and gives it away to the poor. I do not blame them, because traditionally growth and distribution were in an or relationship. You could pursue either growth or distribution in economics. If you wanted to push for economic growth, distribution had to take a back seat. Likewise, distributing wealth meant that you were giving up growth. Shared growth says otherwise. Economic growth and distribution of wealth are not at opposite sides of the spectrum. Growth and distribution can be achieved at the same time by growing the economic pie bigger and distributing the fruit of the growth fairly amongst contributors. I will explain the concept with a hypothetical scenario. let's say that Korea's economic output on GDP in 2015 is 100, and that 50% of the output went to the major conglomerates, while the other 50% went to SMEs. Now, let's imagine that Korean economy grew by 20% in 2016, bringing Korea's GDP up to 120. But this time, let's make distribution fairer. Conglomerates take away 45%, while SMEs get 55%. Both parties benefit from the growth because income of the conglomerates went up from 50 to 54, while the income of the SMEs went up from 50 to 66. In other words, the real problem of the Korean economy is that while the SMEs contribute more than 50% of the work, they get much less than what they deserve. When you make the distribution process fairer and pay the SMEs for what they really deserve, we can achieve growth and distribution at the same time. In short, shared growth is about securing the justice in the process of distributing growth fruit. Instead of pursuing economic growth for the sake of growth, shared growth will help Cameroon grow in a healthier and sustainable way. The concept of shared growth can be extended to building cooperative relations with other nations as well. In today's world of highly connectivity, a nation cannot do it alone. Even back in the 1950s, Korea worked with great friends who cared. In response to the UN Security Council Resolution 84, 16 countries came to South Korea's aid during the Korean War. Young men and women from these far-flung lands came and shed their precious blood to defend a country they had not even known and a people they had never met. The proud flags representing these 16 countries fly daily at the War Memorial of Korea in Seoul to commemorate those courageous soldiers. After the war, our allies and the UN lent a valuable hand in rebuilding our war-torn nation. Currently, South Korean agencies and corporations implement diverse humanitarian projects in all corners of the globe to reciprocate the generosity and goodwill that we as a nation received from our dear friends around the world. Likewise, Cameroon must work together with its friends to make a breakthrough, especially so in today's global world. And shared growth philosophy will help her build cooperative relations with other nations. Today, I talked about Korea's rapid economic growth and factors accounting for it. And I added a few remarks about what Cameroon might do differently in order to grow in a healthier and more sustainable way. Each country is different. Cameroon is a much bigger country than Korea with less population. But I do believe that emphasis of education and high spirits to excel are universal factors that will help any nation go far. I have no doubt that Cameroon's strategic plans with shared growth in mind will help her build her own economic growth model, and that other nations in the future will be asking, how did Cameroon do it? In recent years, South Korea led initiatives to enhance the international development aid model. In addition to assisting struggling countries with funds and materials or the hardware, Korea has also emphasized the provision of software for economic development, such as strengthening public education, creating efficient economic development and infrastructure plans, and building social welfare networks. I sincerely hope that Cameroon will continue to work together with Korea and that the two nations will share their growths. It was truly an honor and privilege for me to speak in front of honored guests today. And with that, I would like to conclude my speech. Thank you very much for your attention.